To the story now, the Western Cape government is talking tough against ongoing threat of what has become known as the construction mafia.
The Special Investigative Unit is conducting search and seizure operations in Kimberley. It relates to alleged corruption at the National Lotteries Commission.
Nomamgoma described how she saw her husband counting money given to him by the Gupta brothers.
Well, many disgruntled citizens have taken to social media to vent their rage as load shedding appears to get worse with each passing day.
They say they are South Africa's elite cops. Young, educated, keen to stamp out crime. Our own FBI. A special unit to monitor, search out and bust criminals, all in one.
In June 1999, former President Thabo Mbeki announced the establishment of an adequately staffed and resourced investigative unit to deal with all national priority crimes, including police corruption. In September 1999, the Directorate of Special Operations, the DSO, or the Scorpions, was established, which at its peak had an impressive 90% conviction rate. Because the introduction of the Scorpions had not been preceded by a widespread public discussion or debate in Parliament, and because Mbeki had taken the lead so soon after taking office, the political opposition parties expressed some doubt on the day of the introduction. Mbeki was able to accomplish this because the ANC held majority seats in parliament. And on the surface, it appeared that the party was moving as a collective and that all party leaders shared a common vision. However, it's not the opposition parties that led the call for the Scorpions to be disbanded. It would be the members of the very same party which founded this directorate. Shortly after the establishment of the DSO, the Scorpions confirmed that they would undertake an investigation into the arms procurement process, also known as the arms deal, that had been concluded in 1999 to the value of 43 billion rands, nearly $7 billion. The deal, which has been subject to allegations of corruption by high-profile ANC members in government, is yet to be resolved to this day. The Scorpions would soon become notorious for their raids of houses of high-ranking politicians within the ANC, including the homes of Jacob Zuma, former Transport Minister Mark Maharaj, and a certain Durban businessman who goes by the name Shabir Sheikh. It was the investigation by the Scorpions into the role played by Zuma in the arms deal that ultimately led to the question being raised about the Directorate's accountability and location within the National Prosecuting Unit, rather than the South African Police Service. It could be argued that this was the investigation that led to the downfall of the unit. The DSO, or the Scorpions, was launched in September 1999 and began legal operation in January 2001. The Directorate was tasked with investigating organized crime with the objective of prosecuting such offences. The formation of the Scorpions coincided with the signing of the International Convention against transnational organized crime in Palermo in the year 2000. Also, the Directorate was formed shortly after the passing of the Prevention of Organized Crime Act of 1998. It was clear from the way the Prevention of Organized Crime Act and the DSO's legislation was drafted that the DSO was intended to be the primary agency to enforce the racketeering and gang provisions contained in the POC Act, while the Asset Forfeiture Unit would make use of the criminal and civil asset forfeiture provision in conjunction with the DSO and the South African Police Service. At the time, South Africa was characterized in the media as a place where the levels of violent crime, as well as crimes committed by organized criminal networks, were rapidly on the increase. It could be argued that, as a result of a general liberalization that came with democratization in 1994, South Africa increasingly became a target for international drug syndicates, both as a market and as a springboard for onward distribution. The inability on the part of law enforcement to deal with the upsurge in criminal activity provided fertile ground for vigilante groups to fill the gap. The role and rapid expansion of organized crime, both in South Africa and other emerging democracies, has been well documented. It's enough to say that the conventional approach to law enforcement has been notably ineffective. This is at least partly what motivated the establishment of a prosecution-led investigative unit within the National Prosecuting Authority. Once the DSO had been established, the National Prosecuting Authority housed the National Prosecuting Services, the Directorate of Special Operations, the Witness Protection Program, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, the specialized units such as the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Units, and the Specialized Commercial Crime Unit. The National Prosecuting Act of 1999 provided the Directorate, the Scorpions, with investigative powers. The Scorpions were headed by a Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions. It had two main directorates, namely Strategic Investigative Support and Operations. The Scorpions had both a legislative and operational mandate, meaning they could both investigate and prosecute cases. The broad legislative mandate of the DSO was to do anything necessary for criminal proceedings on offences committed in organized fashion or relating to any other offences proclaimed by the President in the Gazette. This would end up proving to be quite the double-edged sword. Such a broad mandate was intended to enable the Scorpions to investigate almost any matter and to avoid any jurisdiction battles between itself and the South African police with regards to policing and investigative powers. In terms of Section 7 of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, the Directorate had the power to investigate, gather, keep, and analyze information. The operational mandate was envisaged as being somewhat narrower and negotiated. It was planned that the DSO would discuss and negotiate the kinds of cases it could take on, both with the Minister of Justice and the SAPS. There was awareness about the potential for conflict between the police and the Scorpions, about which cases the DSO could take on and which they could not. This conflict manifested quickly, partly as a consequence of the change in South African Police Service leadership from George Vivas in 2000 to Jackie Silevi, who was less open to the DSO than his predecessor. One could argue what was he hiding, but we soon figured it out. This was not helped when the DSO, rather than the Independent Complaints Directorate or the South African Police Service, was tasked to investigate police brutality after a video was released showing a police dog attacking an illegal immigrant. The Scorpions was a multidisciplinary agency that investigated and prosecuted organized crime and corruption. Its staff of 536 consisted of some of the best police, financial, forensic, and intelligence experts in the country. The Scorpions also recruited a number of few young staff members who received training in the US and the UK, something that had both advantages and drawbacks for the Scorpions.
The Scorpions have the legal powers to investigate and prosecute their cases.
When you have a policeman investigating on his own and you have a prosecutor separate in court, there's no clear lines of accountability in terms of when the docket is handed over, who's now responsible for it. If there's an acquittal at the end, what is the prosecutor could blame the policeman and say there was a bad investigation, and vice versa. The policeman or the investigator blames the prosecution, saying that the case wasn't prosecuted properly. With this troika principle of the Scorpions, that can't happen because they work together from the outset.
The methodology used by the Directorate of Special Operations was based on the troika principle, which integrated analysis, investigation, and prosecution. A DSO investigative team consisted of investigators, prosecutors, and analysts who collected intelligence information. After completing an investigation, investigators would refer a case to a court, and the prosecutor who was involved in the initial stage of the investigation would lead the prosecution. This approach was often criticized because it was believed that the involvement of the prosecutors who were part of the investigation team compromised the separation of powers. The South African Constitution orders the separation of powers into legislative, executive, and the judiciary. The legislative authority formulates and adopts policy, whilst the executive authority is responsible for the execution of policy, and the judicial authority passes judgment in all cases before the courts. Since the Directorate's investigation teams consisted of prosecutors, investigators, and intelligence gatherers, the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development would later argue that this compromised the separation of powers, creating a player that was also the referee. and thereby compromising the doctrine of the separation of powers. However, with the DSO's success in high-profile cases, public confidence grew in its ability to impact on organized crime. In 2004, money laundering and racketeering were added to its priorities, and the DSO succeeded in obtaining the first ever convictions for racketeering in South Africa. By February 2004, the DSO had completed 653 cases, comprising 273 investigations and 380 prosecutions. Of these 380 prosecutions, 349 resulted in convictions, representing an average conviction rate of 93.1%. However, this success led to criticism of the DSO, accusation of the Directorate's cherry-picking of cases. Specifically, the Directorate was accused of choosing to investigate and prosecute only matters they were sure to win. Sometimes, these accusations went further to suggest that the Directorate had a tendency to take over cases already substantially investigated by the South African Police Service, without giving them any credit for their part in the investigation. These accusations were easily justified because the legislation creating the Directorate had provided a broad mandate that did not specify which cases were to be investigated by the police and which by the Directorate.
But their record isn't unblemished. The Scorpions take credit for stopping the political violence in KwaZulu-Natal in the late 1990s. But critics say they undermined police work in the area. In one case, the Ndabezitha massacre, they didn't act on information given to them until they saw it in the papers. They later came under heavy fire for forcing a journalist to testify in the trial. Then a spectacular blunder. In 2000, Samuel Musa Biamane, wanted by the United Nations for genocide, was arrested by the Scorpions. When they failed to tell Home Affairs who the man was, he was deported by mistake.
The downfall of the DSO. The Scorpions gained a reputation for investigating and prosecuting high-profile cases, sometimes involving high-ranking politicians of the ruling party, the African National Congress, the ANC. The Scorpions led a multi-year investigation into the arms deal, which began in 2001 or earlier, which led to the conviction on fraud and corruption charges of ANC politician Tony Yangeni and a businessman named Shapir Sheikh, a close associate of then Deputy President Jacob Zuma, who was himself ultimately charged with corruption. The Congress of South African Trade Unions, the ANC's partner in the Tripartite Alliance, complained publicly about a raid at Zuma's home, alleging that the raid showed that the NPA could be manipulated and influenced to take biased political decisions and act accordingly. Zuma later unsuccessfully challenged the legality of a raid on his former attorney's offices. At the time of the Scorpions disbanding, they had reinstated corruption charges against Zuma. The last raid the Scorpions ever undertook was reportedly a major raid on BAE systems in Pretoria and in Cape Town in November 2008, both linked with the arms deal probe. In 2004, they arrested Mark Thatcher, son of former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, at his house in Cape Town in relation to suspected involvement in a coup attempt in Equatorial Guinea earlier that year. He pled guilty in Cape Town High Court to contravening the regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act of 1999. In 2005, the Scorpions charged 40 or more members of the parliament, primarily ANC members, for fraud in the then so-called Travelgate scandal. More than 30 MPs, including Batabile Dlamini, were ultimately convicted on fraud or related charges. And from 2006 or earlier, the Scorpions investigated National Police Commissioner and close Mbeki ally Jackie Silebi, also for corruption. Silebi was ultimately convicted following a highly publicized trial, in the run-up to which the chief prosecutor, Gerinel of the Scorpions, was himself arrested, and the head of the NPA, Vusi Pikoli, was suspended. The Scorpions also investigated and charged Mafia Don Vito Palazzolo, mining magnate Billy Rutenbach, and both on drug and smuggling charges related to the death of ANC donor Brett Kebo.
In 2005, the NPA successfully prosecuted President Zuma's financial advisor Shabir Sheikh. The prosecutor argued there was a generally corrupt relationship between Sheikh and Zuma. This related to several payments that were made to Zuma. Sheikh argued they were loans. The court found it questionable that these so-called loans would be given to someone who would not be able to pay them back.
In the State versus Shabir Sheikh and others, the accused, Shabir Sheikh, was found guilty of corruption and fraud and was sentenced to 15 years in jail. The court found that he had contravened the Corruption Act of 1992. The first charge related to 238 payments into the account of a politician holding high office. The second charge related to incorrect journal entries in the financial statements of the accused companies. And the third charge related to soliciting of a bribe by the accused throughout the trial, which lasted from 21 January 2002 to 17 February 2005. Sheikh's relationship with then President Jacob Zuma was in question, yet Zuma was never called to testify either for the state or the accused. This led to questions being raised in the media about why Zuma was not charged jointly with Shabir Sheikh. In 2005, when Sheikh was found guilty and convicted, President Thabo Mbeki dismissed Zuma as deputy president.
I've come to the conclusion that the circumstances dictate that in the interest of the Honorable Deputy President, the government, our young democratic system and our country, it would be best to release Honorable Jacob Zuma from his responsibilities as Deputy President of the Republic and member of the Cabinet.
Very apprehensive, very expectant, but of course very tense, because it's always tense. None of us knew what the result was.
The number of votes received by Comrade Thabo Mbeki, 1,505.
And there was a section of the hall which erupted.
Can I move on, please?
And then she asked them to be quiet, and then she, Jacob Zuma.
The number of votes received by Comrade Jacob Zuma, 2,389.
A move that led to enormous political tension in the ANC and amongst its alliance partners, as Zuma was the preferred successor of Mbeki for COSATU, the ANC and the Youth League, and others within the ruling party. The conviction of Sheikh did not signal the end of the Scorpions investigation, and shortly thereafter, on 18 August 2005, the Scorpions raided Sheikh's house, this time searching for evidence against Zuma. These raids were heavily criticized by the Union Federation COSATU, who accused the National Prosecuting Authority and the judicial system of being manipulated and influenced to take biased political decisions and action. This case, and the Scorpions' handling of it, was arguably the single most important factor leading to its downfall, not least because during the course of the DSO's investigation, several mistakes were made. One of these was to violate the principle of attorney-client privilege. Section 14 of the Constitution provides for the right of an individual to refuse to disclose admissible evidence. This means that any confidential communication made directly between a client and his or her legal advisor, or made by any means of an agent, is privileged, and that a person cannot be compelled to disclose such information. Neither is he or she compelled to disclose any communication that was obtained with a view to litigation. In 2006, the Scorpions had also raided the offices of Zuma's lawyers and seized documents for the purpose of an investigation into the alleged corruption charges. Zuma brought a case against the Scorpions for violating attorney-client privilege that was upheld by the court. The court ruled that the actions of the Directorate of Special Operations were a direct violation of Section 201 of the Criminal Procedure Act and Section 35 of the Constitution. With the DSO having taken on such high-profile political cases so early in its existence, it was almost inevitable that it would attract such strong criticism. at least from those who saw it as meddling in power broking in the ruling party. Criticism focused on the location and mandates of the Directorate, prompting President Thabo Mbeki in 2005 to establish an independent commission of inquiry headed by the judge C.C. Kampepe. The Kampepe Commission of Inquiry. It was the Commission's mandate to obtain clarity in respect to the location, mandate and operation of the DSO in relation to other relevant government departments or institutions, and to make findings, report on and make recommendations regarding the accountability, effectiveness, efficiency and oversight in respect to the Intelligence Operations Directorate. After almost 1 year of deliberations and research, the Kampepe Commission report was finalized. The Commission found that while the Scorpions as a structure was not unconstitutional, it did not, however, have a legal basis to collect intelligence, and that the DSO was mandated to gather, keep, and analyze information in terms of Section 7 of the NPA Act. The evidence brought before the Commission, as well as the on-site visits to the Scorpions headquarters, tended to show that the Scorpions had established intelligence gathering capabilities. As a result, the Commission found that this was in serious violations of Section 1, 2, and 3 of the National Strategic Intelligence Act of 1994. The Kampepe Commission also found that the Directorate lacked oversight. The National Prosecution Act made provisions for the establishment of a ministerial coordinating committee to develop regulations and standard operating procedures for members of the Scorpions. However, the same section did not make provisions for the establishment of a structure or institution to oversee the Scorpions, which the ministerial committee was not expected to do. Furthermore, the Commission found that neither the Minister of Police or Minister of Justice exercised practical or effective oversight over the Scorpions. It is also noted that while the NPA Act made provision for the Minister of Police to exercise oversight over the Scorpions, such provision was not extended to the Inspector General of Intelligence. Section 7 of the Intelligence Services Oversight Act makes provisions for the establishment of an Inspector General for Intelligence, and functions are to monitor and review the intelligence and counterintelligence activities of any service. So far, it has been shown that the mistakes by the Scorpions themselves, the failure of the law and executive to determine the appropriate oversight over the unit, as well as the intense political pressure as a consequence of pursuing investigations that involved high-level politicians, all contributed to the downfall of the Scorpions. If you enjoyed this video, please help me by liking the video, leaving a comment on what you'd like me to cover also, and please join me again for the next video. Thank you very much.